a lot of my weekend yelling at people on X, which, maybe I shouldn't do, but I spent a lot of my weekend just sitting on my couch, deflating from the long election week. And I learned something. I learned something yesterday. Apparently, I'm to blame for Republicans in Washington state losing everything. Apparently, I'm to blame because I'm an independent. And I'm not a Republican. And the mistake the Republican Party made was cozying up to someone who calls herself an independent and not a Republican. Yeah. So you don't have to go on X and follow the whole drama. But I pointed out something on X that's just true. The Washington State Republican Party, every candidate in statewide and federal office that delegates endorsed at the WA GOP convention before the primary lost, every single one of them lost in statewide elected office and then in the federal races. The only two Republicans who won out of all the statewide races and the federal races were Dan Newhouse, a Republican in the 4th Congressional District, and Michael Baumgartner, who won the congressional seat in the 5th District. And they were not endorsed by delegates because they weren't far enough to the right. They were not endorsed by delegates at the Republican state convention. Now, after they moved forward in the primary, Michael Baumgartner got the endorsement, but in the 4th, the party stuck with Jared Sessler over the sitting congressman, Dan Newhouse. So the point I was making was essentially that the Republican Party has some introspection to do. And, everybody has introspection to do, right? But for instance, what you're seeing at the national level right now are Democrats, what are they doing with the Donald Trump loss? They're blaming racism and sexism. Basically saying that Donald Trump beat Kamala Harris, not because their policies are so horrible, not because they put up a horrible candidate, didn't have an actual process to go through to pick a nominee, not because any of that, but because all of you who voted for Donald Trump are racists or misogynists. It's unhinged, right? But that thought process is exactly what's happening right now among some members of the Washington State Republican Party. It's not like, hey, why do we keep losing so badly? Hey, why did we endorse further to the right candidates at our state convention rather than more electable candidates who are further to the center? Why do we do that in a blue state? Is there something we can do to not alienate the middle, right? Because we can only win as Republicans in a blue state by addition and not subtraction. So rather than being introspective, rather than look in a mirror, they're lashing out. And they're trying to figure out who can we blame for our utter defeat rather than ourselves. Well, apparently some of them want to blame me. So Dale Whitaker, who ran for Secretary of State and lost, decidedly so, to Steve Hobbs, put out a 20-minute video taking issue with that sentiment from me, that Republicans really need to take a minute, take a beat, look in the mirror and ask themselves, what can they do better? 20-minute video. Here's part of it.
With that said, there have been some things over the last few months that really struck me, not just of being unhelpful, but being inherently destructive to Republicans and the Republican Party in Washington State. Why have we allowed a self-proclaimed independent to become the voice of Republicanism in Washington State? Why is someone who didn't have the ability to realize over the last 30 years of their life that their politics were so destructive up until this cycle, why are they being elevated as they are some kind of savior to Republicanism in Washington State?
Wow. First of all, who elevated me to the status of savior of Republicanism? I didn't ask for that title. I didn't ask anyone to give me that title. I've never heard anyone refer to me as the savior of Republicanism. I don't know who elevated me to be the voice of Republicanism in Washington State. I say every time I go to a Republican event that I'm an independent. In fact, I even say that I don't like the two-party system. But the message that I've given to Republican groups that have invited me to attend is that I am on their side because we need them to save the state from one-party rule. So in that sense, I am an ally. I will go to war with them in the battle against the likes of Bob Ferguson. And I happen to have a very large platform. And among certain circles, I happen to be, I think, fairly influential. And also, we happen to have worked our asses off for no reason. 95% of everything we did on this show that Nicole and I did throughout the last year has been for free. There might have been a few keynote speeches that I gave after being invited by Republican county parties to try to rally the troops that were paid, because if I give a keynote speech, unless it's for charity, I'm going to ask to be paid for it. 90% of what we did to help Republicans and Republican candidates for the good of the state over the last year was done for free. Nicole and I have barely had a day off for 7 months. We have been crisscrossing the state. I looked at my odometer today, 17,000 miles on a brand new car. I've clocked on it. Driving to Spokane, Okanagan, out to the coast. We have been everywhere. Spending our Saturdays in October and September out rallying volunteers to knock on doors for Dale Whitaker and for the initiatives. You think somebody was paying us to do that? You think I was doing that as an independent to destroy the Republican Party and I was secretly knocking on doors saying, don't vote for the Republicans? Yet for some reason in Dale Whitaker's mind, I'm the problem. Because can you play that cut again? The first cut, Nicole? This is unhinged to me. Watch it again.
With that said, there have been some things over the last few months that really struck me, not just of being unhelpful, but being inherently destructive to Republicans and the Republican Party in Washington State. Why have we allowed a self-proclaimed independent to become the voice of Republicanism in Washington State?
I didn't ask for that.
Why is someone who didn't have the ability to realize over the last 30 years of their life that their politics were so destructive up until this cycle, why are they being elevated as they are some kind of savior to Republicanism in Washington?
I didn't ask to be elevated. I'm just doing my job. And also, he's sitting there reading off a script, these attacks on me. Maybe if you could put together or string a few good sentences together, they'd ask you to speak at their events. Like, I'm sorry, maybe that says more about the Republican Party that all these county parties have to bring in an independent podcaster to get everyone excited about the election because they can't find any Republicans who can give a good enough speech. That's not my fault. But also that thing he said there about who hasn't been able to, for the last 30 years of her life, make good decisions. Well, not 30 years ago, I was 6. 30 years ago, I was 6 years old. In fact, it's only been for about 14 years I've been able to vote. And of course, much of that I was in my 20s, and most people in their 20s have no freaking clue what they're doing. So yeah, I've made no secret that I've come around to a lot of conservative issues. It's called growing up. It's called learning. It's called being, influenced by your environment. And as I've gotten older, as I've gotten wiser, as I've gotten smarter, I've looked around at what's happening, and I've decided that conservative principles are more for me. And you're going to vilify me for that? You're going to vilify me as an independent for coming around to voting for Donald Trump for the first time, for spending the last year, probably more, donating our valuable time to these issues. And I would also point out, well, actually, let play this next clip too, because in this long 20-minute rant where it's like, let's blame anyone else but ourselves, he has quite a few contradictions. Here it is.
We have to be honest with ourselves here. The moderate experiment has failed. It has failed. And with that, I've said throughout my campaign that the biggest problem with republicanism in Washington State is that people call for unity while doing things that breed disunity.
The moderate experiment has failed. Shame on you guys for breeding disunity. So aren't you doing that there? Aren't you doing that when you attack me for being an independent? When you say the moderate experiment has failed, but we need to come together? That makes no sense. Like, either you're going to be someone that welcomes moderates and independents or you're not. Because I'll tell you what, Dale, I could just as easily, and probably would make more sense, if I dedicate my time and efforts to trying to help moderate Democrats keep their seats. Should I have then maybe spent time helping Mark Mullet's campaign? Because moving forward, that might be a better idea. And as far as the media ecosystem, do you really think that the media ecosystem in Washington state would better serve Republicans if I weren't part of it? Like, the answer to that is obviously no. But here's one other thing I want to say about Dale Whitaker's assessment that the moderate experiment has failed. Again, that makes no sense on its face, right? Because we're in a blue state. So the idea that we'd win if we only went further to the right, if we were only deeper red, that makes no sense. That's about one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. But I just went through, I don't have a graphic to put up, but I pulled the vote totals for every race for statewide office for the Republican candidates. Every race. So we are talking, because I'm going to prove my point here, governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, state treasurer, state auditor, attorney general, commissioner of public lands, superintendent of public instruction, insurance commissioner. So I pulled the actual vote totals. So how many, not the percentages, how many individual voters did each of the Republican candidates in those races get? You know, out of all of those races, which Republican candidate got the fewest votes? Does anybody want to guess? Dale Whitaker for Secretary of State. Out of every single one of those races for the Republican candidate, he got the fewest votes. Fewer than the Republican running for treasurer, for auditor, than the Republican running for AG, for lieutenant governor, for commissioner of public lands. The Republican who got the lowest number of actual votes across the state was Dale Whitaker. And he wants to get on a 20-minute video and preach that he knows what's going on, that the moderate experiment has failed. Your experiment failed. Your experiment of going from someone no one knew in the state to your very first run for public office being Secretary of State. That sounds like a failure to me, right? And look, I commend anyone who wants to run for public office. What I don't commend is someone who wants to go on a 20-minute rant when they had the worst statewide race of any Republican. And then you want to say that I'm the problem. You know who did the best? You know the two who did the best, speaking of the moderate experiment had failed of all the Republicans? The two most moderate Republicans, Jamie Herrera Butler and Dave Reichert, got the most individual votes. Not the furthest to the right candidates, not you, Dale Whitaker, the two moderate Republican candidates for statewide office for the GOP. And by the way, both of them were candidates that did not get the endorsement of Republicans at the state GOP convention over the summer. So they were unendorsed. They were not endorsed by their own party, which is the point I made at the beginning. And they made it through the primary regardless. And then they got the most votes out of any Republican candidates. So your video doesn't make sense. I do take offense to it. And we're going to continue to support candidates that we think are in the best interest of the state, whether Republicans like you want us to help or not. So, chew on that, Dale. Is that too mean? Nicole's looking at me like, is that too mean? Don't think so. It's offensive. Is that not offensive? Does it not piss you off that the bottom line, and he was not the only one. There were, semi-bird Republicans like Brandi is evil, bah, bah, bah. It's like, okay, like, would you rather have me on your side or working against you? That's the question, right? Would you rather have me working for you or working against you? Because I can do either.